All right, Doc, I think we're about to go live, but we may want to just hold off for 1 second. Let's see.
Okay.
See if we can get off camera. We're live now on my channel. So I'm going to pause. Live now on my channel. All right, Doc, what is going on? How are you today, my brother?
Hey, good seeing your face. Yes, yes, yes.
I had to get everything together, man. So we are actually live streaming right now.
Okay.
We have about 3 minutes before we're technically supposed to start. So,
Okay.
man, just tell us what's been going on with you before we actually get into your lecture.
Yeah, just pray for me. I should hear back from Fulbright sometime in a couple days or so. They said that towards the end of February, but hopefully in March I'll find out that hopefully because it's on South African's desk right now. So
And hopefully you'll be returning soon.
yeah, so things are good. I'm going up for tenure this year, and yeah, one of my articles that's actually centered on this talk that I'm doing this evening, um, focusing on pandemics in New Orleans, in particular with Springer Journal, well, Geo Journal, Springer Press. I just found out that it got accepted uh, uh, with revisions, but will be accepted for publication. So I'm feeling pretty good about that
Oh, congratulations.
those news. Yeah.
Congratulations, my brother. That's all right. I'm working on something right now. It's taking me a long time to get it together, but it should be out at some point.
All right.
Um, we're about 2 minutes away. I tell you what,
Should I
right now we
share?
have, yeah, I've made you co-host.
Okay.
So, and we'll just go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome everybody to the third installment of the Black History Month series sponsored by the African Center for the Study of the United States. I am Dr. Assad El Malik, and we're super excited for today's presentation with Dr. Blair Proctor, who's also family over here at the African Center for the Study of the United States. So, again, we have been doing this all month long to celebrate Black history. And we are, again, excited about this talk that Dr. Blair Proctor is going to give. Professor Proctor. Is that what your students call you, Professor Proctor? Or
I mean, they
Doc?
call me, Dr. Blair, Dr. BP, Dr. Proctor, but I tell them quickly that you ain't my friend. So put some respect on my name. So,
I earned this one. Yeah, I earned the doctor.
and
All right, brother.
my
So
student loans remind me.
yeah, student loans, exactly. Every time you get that payment in the mail, I have to put that payment in the mail. You're like, yeah, I earned this PhD. It's
Right.
definitely my brother. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you because I think we're all excited for this lecture. And what I'm going to do, I'll give you this is your floor. So
All right.
I'll fall back off camera and jump on towards the end with my questions and some of the questions from the people watching on YouTube.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right, my brother.
All right. Well, good evening on the South African end of the earth. I am Dr. Blair Marcus Proctor, and I am an assistant professor in the Black Studies Department at the State University of New York at New Paltz. It's the second oldest Black Studies department in the nation after San Francisco State opened in 1968. We opened in October of 1969. So we're over 50 years of teaching Black history from an Africana studies perspective. So the title of my talk for this evening is Pandemics in New Orleans and Johannesburg, from Jim Crow and Apartheid through COVID-19. My two primary arguments is looking at how the coronavirus has contributed further trauma to already traumatized groups of people, and also analyzing and studying how racism and white supremacy within itself is a pandemic. Before getting into my talk, I wanted to start with a quote. Let's see, how do we go to the next slide? Here we go. By the late Frantz Fanon, and psychologist and activist scholar. When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. So keep that quote in mind when we talk about the concept of breathing, both literally and also figuratively. My comparative research applies to global conversation centering on how the endemics of systemic racism, poverty, and the environment are occurrences that affect people of African descent. Incorporating the concepts of environmental justice into my study provides a new angle on pandemics and gives an intersectional view of how COVID-19 disproportionately affects the most marginalized, oppressed, and ghettoized communities. In short, these pandemics take a direct toll on the African diasporic community's health and life chances. Due to COVID-19 continuing to ravage the world, and from an environmental justice frame, through the theoretical model of Achille Mbembe's necropolitics concept, I will analyze how urbanisms and public health disparities in New Orleans and actions of neocolonialism transpiring in post-apartheid South Africa disproportionately affect Black New Orleans and Johannesburg urban communities. Moreover, I will discuss how the need for environmental justice is to occur due to the current handlings of COVID-19 on the local municipal levels maintains Black global oppression and suppression. This study is an extension of my dissertation titled Blurred Consciousness, How Blackness in Space Shapes Identity Formation Among South African Coloreds and New Orleans Creoles, through applying racial formation theory, métissage, which is a French word for miscegenation or race mixing, and intersectionality theoretical concepts. I explored how the Afro-Creole and colored communities had similar historiographies in regards to their identity formation. The 17th century European elite categorized, socially constructed, and transformed heterogeneous ethnic groups into homogeneous mixed race peoples and positioned in métissage, an ideology of neither white nor black, established ambiguous and multifaceted consciousness. However, what I did not explore in my dissertation was how racism is essentially a pandemic, along with systemic racism and concentrated poverty, which contributes to the spreading of stress, hypertension, high blood pressure, substandard living conditions, sanitation, unemployment, drug use, gang activity and violence, police brutality, poor diet and eating habits, and food apartheid that plagues de facto racially segregated neighborhoods in New Orleans and Johannesburg within the 21st century. So I think it's important to define what environmental justice is before getting into the rest of my talk, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. So we're talking about regulations and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Now, in theory, this sounds great. However, I argue that this is currently not occurring in the moment due to the concept of necropower. So the key sources that I used for my research was Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics, in which he defines necropower or the powers that be, however you define that, whether we're talking about the government, whether we're talking about the police state, or whether we're talking about laws, policies that are put into place that affect certain groups. How does that determine the life chances? How do certain groups live and die due to these policies that are put in place? Also, I use Harriet A. Washington, who is a medical doctor, with her work Medical Apartheid, and also the late great W.E.B. Du Bois, who's known as the father of urban sociology, with his work, The Philadelphia Negro, A Social Study. And the reason why I focused on these three scholars in particular is because they focused on the study of the Black body in spaces of confinement. So whether we're talking about medical experimentation or forced medical experimentation on enslaved African women within the confines of the plantation, or whether we're talking about social or qualitative research methods and study within the confines of the urban ghetto in the late 19th century in Philadelphia. There's also a scholar by the name of Catherine McKittrick, who has a theoretical frame of plantation geography and futures. So her argument is she looks at how does the plantation or confinement of Black bodies change over time. So whether we're talking about the slave castles on the coast of Africa, the slave ship as a plantation, the auction block as a form of plantation future, the plantation itself, obviously, within the confines of those spaces, the laws of Jim Crow and apartheid of confined spaces, the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex. So how is the Black body morphed and shaped and confined with over periods of time? And then her primary question is, what's next? A century ago, Du Bois recognized the connection between social inequalities and health inequalities, raising central arguments related to racism, poverty, and other social problems. Du Bois noted that the Negro death rate and sickness are largely matters of social and economic condition and not due to racial traits and tendencies. And of course, I'm using the term Negro. That was a popular term for Black identity during that period of time. Therefore, as opposed to the 1965 Morningham Report, which argued that Black culture, I read as Black people, are the cause of the ghetto, in actuality, it's public policy that mandated Black confinement within the isolated spaces and lack of services. So we're talking about accessibility. Who has access to resources and who doesn't, period. In Race, Medicine, and Healthcare in the United States, a historical survey by Michael Bird and Linda A. Clayton, they state that by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American medical journals and textbooks were laced with pseudoscientific racist principles, derogatory racial character references, and pronouncements of impending Black racial extinction. In the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, medical article titled Racial Ethnic Disparities in Health, Sociological Contributions by David R. Williams and Michelle Sternthal argue that Du Bois saw racial differences in health as reflecting differences in social advancements, the vastly different conditions under which Blacks and whites lived. They argued that, or Du Bois argued rather, excuse me, although the causes of racial differences in health were multifactorial, they are or were nonetheless primarily social, of course, since race is a social construct. Then the list of contributing factors included poor heredity, neglect of infants, bad dwellings, poor food, and unsanitary living conditions. Again, talking about the environmental conditions of Black confinement. So really what we're talking about is environmental injustices that are put into practices. So how does negro power play out within these contexts? The Jim Crow legalized racial segregation in New Orleans, and the apartheid regime in South Africa contributed to environmental injustice and exile of African descendant populations. So a prime example is the famous Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Here is a photo of Homer A. Plessy. For all intents and purposes, he looks like a white man. However, he is not. He was an Afro-Creole color that was part of the Comité des Citoyens, which translates to the Citizens Committee, in which he purposefully sat on the white section of the streetcar and proclaimed his Blackness, which led to his arrest. And of course, we know this led down the line to the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and which led to separate but equal, but of course we know separate and unequal of the Jim Crow laws of the segregated South, which was of those same states that were part of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Within the South African context, we can talk about the apartheid regime and the Group Areas Act of 1950. However, we should talk about the Urban Areas Act and also the Native Lands Act of 1910, the Urban Areas Act of 1920, and also 1930, in which those during the period of colonialism in the South African region, where Jim Crow-like policies were put into place of racial segregation. Of course, we know that colonialism took place throughout continental Africa. Of course, we know about the famous scramble for Africa with the Berlin Conference of 1884, with the various European empires decided how to divvy up the African continent. And within the South African context, racism and white supremacy within that context was how the race-based system was used to maintain colonialism. So once the Afrikaner Dutch apartheid regime took over with the National Party in 1948, and with the Group Areas Act of 1950, they pretty much maintained those Jim Crow-like laws with the apartheid regime, which is basically an Afrikaner word for being apart or set apart. Colored South Africans were separated from Black South Africans in Sophiatown through forced removals to Westbury, which is my primary research area, which is a neighborhood area in Johannesburg, formerly known as the Western Native Township. It's also important to point out that the racial designation of the term colored actually came into effect during the apartheid regime as well. Prior to that, there was not a concept or racial designation called colored. Blacks and coloreds were also exiled and segregated to racially zoned townships. And if you notice the photo to the right, you can see that process of families that are in the process of being exiled and displaced from Sophiatown into other areas such as Westbury. Other areas were the Meadowlands. But if you notice, there's also a photo to the left where you see a graffiti text of "We won't move." So it should also be important to point out that our ancestors did not fight willingly. Our ancestors have always fought. We fought and rebelled on the continent when slave catchers were trying to separate families. Our ancestors fought on the slave ship. Our ancestors fought on the auction block. Our ancestors fought on the plantation itself. We fought through the Jim Crow eras with the civil rights eras, the Black Power movements, the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, and the anti-apartheid movements involved through the ANC. So we have to understand that we come from an ancestors of fighters and not simply victims that just accepted our lived conditions. Also incorporated into my research the late Martin Luther King's work of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, which was published a year to his assassination in 1968, back in 1967. And this work primarily was a reflection on his civil rights acts of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, also March on Selma, in which he actually had a regret in the movement being referred to as the civil rights movement. He really felt that it should have been referred to as a human rights movement because we were fighting for the humanity of Black people. And there are two famous quotes that come to mind when I think of MLK. One in particular is where he spoke at the March Washington in 1963 with his "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he stated that Black Americans were issued a check with insufficient funds, in which he was making a claim for reparations. And also, he talked about, well, what's the point of being able to go to a restaurant that's integrated if you can't afford the burger and the coffee? So really, he's talking about the roles of poverty and how poverty in itself is also a social construction. So his critiques on the roles of poverty, white supremacy, and resource hoarding, which maintain disenfranchisement. However, he didn't use the term white supremacy in his work. However, he did use the word white racism. However, I argue if you merge white racism and government, if they have a baby, that's white supremacy. He also was the leader of the Poor People's Campaign, and I argue that's what led to his assassination. It's not really about using the same toilet, but don't ever talk about the resources. Throughout the 19th and early to mid 20th century, the Western Academy of Historians and Social Sciences consistently studied people of African descent as objects. To put further, the Black body within itself was socially created into an object, molded, designed, and constructed for designation, place, and exploitation. Western scholars ignored African contribution to modernity due to white superiority, which was and continues to be a global phenomenon. Then I argue that comprehending the interconnectedness of African diasporic and South African history provides a stronger context of understanding how the brutality of the American and South African apartheid regimes placed dominance over African diasporic communities rooted during the slavery and colonial periods. As a corrective research measure, in the 21st century. Specifically, when interviewing core community members integral to my study, it is important for myself to be humble and understand that they are taking time out of their schedules to assist me as a researcher and urban geographer, which meant that I had to be a sound listener. In other words, in order to collect the best thorough data, it was important for me to establish a relationship with members of the community through performing community service in the 7th Ward and Westbury, such as mentoring students at the Westbury Youth Center, participating in community events, and facilitating seminars centered on community and professional development. The relationship amongst individuals is not only centered in African diasporic culture, but in Black studies as a field. Therefore, I was invested with the community members since 2013. So over 10 years, I have a relationship and I continue to have a relationship in New Orleans and Johannesburg, which in turn allowed me to gain trust and respect of the participants in my study. Utilizing I would argue, a Du Boisian qualitative research method. I used for the study involved generating data collection through conducting semi-structured interviews in New Orleans and Johannesburg. I selected the participants, which involved snowball sampling. I contacted associates in both regions who knew 5 people. So I interviewed 5 people in New Orleans and also 5 people in South Africa. In Johannesburg specifically, and provided contact information in order for me to set up the appointments, meeting times, location, and dates of the conducted interviews. And also participant observations were documented and occurred during my field visits. So um, I'm not going to go through all these interview questions. However, I wanted to just point out that these were the questions that I asked the interviewees that participated in my study, such as questions of environmental justice, how did it affect their life, their family, their neighborhood, are they essential workers, and if they had to go to the hospital during the period of COVID-19. So this is during the period of 2020, 2021, of that year period. I also performed archival research and looked at the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa of 1996. So, of course, we're talking about the transition from the apartheid regime that was led by the National Party up to 94, then that transition period with the ANC, the African National Congress. And what stood out in the preamble were 2 key phrases: social justice and fundamental human rights. However, all 5 of my interviews agreed with the assertion that, number one, there is no justice and perpetual trauma reinvents itself. And with the first question, what is your recent experience with environmental justice? A 59-year-old real estate agent and tourist guide stated that, so we got an amazing constitution, though our fundamental rights are not fulfilled. And I followed up with a question asking if she had to go to the hospital during this period of time. And if so, what was her experience? So she said, 3 weeks ago, I felt ill, and about 4 a.m. I collapsed. I was by myself because I live by myself. I made it to the phone, and the first question was, do you have medical aid? Could not afford medical aid, currently unemployed. I'm a tour guide, a freelance tour guide, and obviously because of the pandemic, tours were stopped. And as a result of no medical aid, resulted me waiting for nearly 5 hours for an ambulance. So that is the number one injustice that we suffer in South Africa, is our Constitution guarantees that all shall have access to health, or we have the right to life. So already that right to life was compromised. I also interviewed a 63-year-old social worker who works at the Westbury Youth Center. Do you feel that environmental justice played a role in your family's experiences with the coronavirus? 8 weeks in a row, I buried family members, and that's only family. I lost a lot of friends, a sad period. You could not go to funerals. We were restricted to go to funerals, only to include family members, which was also restricted in size. Um, Also, what's important with other interviewees is that this relived trauma of restriction uh, a lot of the older South African residents who lived during apartheid felt that this was relived trauma of having curfews and having to go through curfews where the government is telling you when you are able to be out, when you're not able to be out. So I think that was very important to point out. And also, when you do qualitative research, there's a term called clustering. And one of the words that kept on coming up was this word of restriction, which is another word for, of course, confinement. With the follow-up question of do you feel that your job was impacted by COVID-19? The police, again, restricted us or confined us from being on the streets to serve. The certificates gave us permission to be out on the streets, started with 100 people on a Sunday, then feeding from Monday through Sunday, 600 children per day for 7 days a week for 4 months. Specifically was 100,000 rands, which I would translate to roughly about 10,000 or shy US dollars in support for food. We cooked at the center. So this is to say that if the community had not come together to support each other, they would have starved during that period of time. The fact that they actually had to have a contract to serve food, to take care of their family, that is a prime example of what I would argue is necropower. Within the New Orleans context, all 5 of my interviewees agreed with the assertion that number 1, life in New Orleans changed after Hurricane Katrina. Number 2, gentrification and cultural appropriation are erasing the African diasporic and Creole roots of New Orleans, which affects the social and physical environment of the community. And number 3, COVID-19 contributed to further unresolved trauma. I don't know if y'all remember. I remember watching on the news how it was conducted and how racist the media was in terms of reporting Hurricane Katrina, especially directed towards the victims. And the 3 key words I kept on hearing was looters, rapists, and refugees, which continues with um, providing dehumanization to the victims because Black people are not supposed to feel pain, right? Um, in the left-hand corner, there's 3 victims. One is a Black victim on the top, the second are white victims, and how they reported. A young man walked through chest-deep flood waters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, as opposed to 2 residents wading through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda at a grocery store. Again, same event, same water, same trauma. However, we're going to remind that the Black victim is a looter. Keep that in mind when we talk about necropolitics and the need for environmental justice. With the 55-year-old business owner, I asked the same question: what is your recent experience of environmental justice? The power that they have tends to favor those who look like them. Power doesn't flow to those who really need it, but it flows to those who are of a certain color, who already have power, white folks. The second question, how has your experience been affected due to the fact of the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19 pandemic occurring simultaneously? So of course, we're talking about this period of time when the late George Floyd was being lynched and murdered on live TV. And his last words was to his dead mother saying, "I can't breathe." It just shows that they, in terms of law enforcement, the powers that be, don't stop no matter what. They still on top of somebody's neck. They're not interested in changing that. Nothing changes, nothing changes. Nothing surprised me at all. I don't think a national group can change that. Needs to be a much more local level, grassroots, not from top down, but from down up. And then I also asked, how does environmental justice impact in your neighborhood with COVID-19? We experienced the second biggest hurricane, August 24th of last year. During Katrina, it was about the flooding last year. So we're talking about roughly 2021. Was about the lights. We still couldn't stay in our homes because the electricity was out. You had to have cash, again, because of lack of power. Folks that had gas generators were out of luck because there was no gas. I was stuck for 4 days because I did not have gas to go to Houston. And from a 26-year-old barista, justice, well, coming up a year on Fat Tuesday, and I was here, I had to stay during the storm. Because many ask, well, why don't folks leave? Well, many folks can't afford to leave. And I didn't leave because I can't afford. So I decided that I would take the chance. And I saw that a lot of other people who had rode out a lot of storms were staying about that period of time, having no lights for about 2.5 weeks or something like that. No light, no fridge, can't keep food fresh. It was unbearable for some people. But I really enjoyed being close to my neighbors in that way. And I found it really interesting that she ended that quote with saying that she enjoyed being close to her neighbors. But that's when we talk about collective trauma, at least as a community, if you have to wait it out, it's better to wait it out with others as opposed to waiting it out by yourself. So, in conclusion, pandemics of the coronavirus and racism at the root will affect African diasporic communities due to perpetual actions of social constructions, racial hierarchy, and power dynamics, which maintain Black Johannesburg and New Orleans communities within a marginalized state. Since 2020, the coronavirus has added an additional layer of a pandemic that perpetuates further trauma amongst an already oppressed group of African diasporic communities. And I'll end with this quote by Fleeknick. Racism got time. During war, during apocalypse, racism always has time. However, we are strong because of our ancestors, and we will continue to breathe. Thank you.
All right, having a little technical difficulties. Thank you, my brother. Phenomenal presentation. Now, I believe the people in the chat on YouTube are definitely loving it. I have a few questions. You know, once you touched on New Orleans, I was gonna get to start talking.
Of course, that's your home.
You know, I could. Um, well, I want to kind of start from the latter part of your presentation, where there's a quote from the young lady, the barista, who said she felt she enjoyed being close to her neighbors, and I just want to kind of set the scene for people who don't understand what was going on in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. This storm comes, 80% of the city is flooded. There's no power. There's no access to clean water. There's no food. There's no gasoline, as you mentioned. People's whose homes were not flooded were like on little deserts in the city that at some point became extremely violent uh, uh, for whatever reason. So this is like civil society dissolving into chaos at some point. And this lady is saying, I felt close to my neighbors. And what it made me think about was times when I have stayed during a hurricane. You already know what to expect. When the storm passes, you won't have power. So one time, my wife and I had just gotten married. Storm comes through. This is maybe 2009, 2010. And what I noticed was because we had no power, I heard someone practicing the saxophone. My neighbors, if you know about the when your refrigerator goes out, you need to start cooking all of the meat that you have in your refrigerator because it's going to go bad.
Yep.
So the only way to cook it is to barbecue it, right? To put it on the grill. So my neighbors are barbecuing. I'm outside picking up trash in my lawn and in their lawn, picking up debris and stuff. And it was at that point that I realized how much technology, TV, music, the iPhones, and all of these things kind of separate us from our human friend, our human neighbors, you know. So I just want you to touch on that. When you heard her say that, what did you think?
Yeah. So I did a little bit of cheating because that was my niece. So when it comes to Black studies, we got to interview our people, right?
Right, exactly.
So but it was because I will say that, to use the word enjoyed, it was I feel that when it comes to Black trauma, we tend to focus on Black trauma a lot, but we also don't focus on Black joy of what we have
Mm,
to do to cope with the trauma.
yeah.
And um and our people and our ancestors are not, we are not a single people. Like we are strong because of our community. Like we're strong because of our peoples. Like we're not just
Yeah.
strong just because of the immediate family. Like you strong because your grandmama, papa, your second, we don't, my family, my aunt who passed away just now it's year two, she was my second mama.
Yeah.
So it's uh for her, and now I'm going back to my niece, that it was, she got to know her roommates very well. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
She got to know her neighbors really well because they were dependent because she forgot to stock up. So she had to go over to her neighbor so that she was able to eat,
Mm,
things of that nature.
yeah.
So it's that, and I go back to even before Katrina. I talk about on the slave ship there was community that was being formed, right? On the plantations, communities were being formed, families were being formed because families were also being separated as well.
Mm,
So I feel that when I look at Katrina, I look at that as a continuum of the African diaspora, of families, some that dispersed, some that either might have been away already that weren't able to go back home, because some folks might have been going to conferences or were out of the state or were out of the
yeah.
region. So that separated families. So you make do when you were going through a traumatic event. And I think that for her, even though she was like, okay, I don't know how long the storm is going to, how long this is going to happen, this is going to occur, but at least I know that I can depend on other neighbors because they're experiencing that same traumatic occurrence.
Yeah. Type
Does
of
that make
trauma
sense?
bonding. Yeah,
Trauma
it's a
bonding.
trauma bonding. Yeah.
Right.
Uh, I
So,
want to
and I would
talk.
say that, and real quick, I would just say in that case, trauma bonding is good
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because
It's
trauma
good in
bonding ain't always good.
that.
You know
Exactly.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You make do with what you
So
got, but it's in a positive way.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, the Sophia Town,
Mm,
um, Sophia Town, and these kind of forced removals.
mm,
Um, how would you compare that to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina
mm.
and African Americans looking to reclaim their land in New Orleans?
Absolutely. So, so of course, so my training is urban planning and also community redevelopment. So that's in geography. So when you talk about structures, especially as an urban planner, we don't look, so there's a difference between architects and urban planners. Like architects, you design the building, your heart and soul's in the building. For urban planner, it's the bodies that occupy the building. It's the neighborhoods that are formed, which then forms the wards, forms the locality, the jurisdictions, if you will. So when you're talking about um, exile,
Mm,
whether we're talking about through Mother Nature, which is of course what Hurricane Katrina was. However, even before Hurricane Katrina, there was gentrification that was occurring within New Orleans, but it wasn't just unique to New Orleans; it was unique to all of urban America.
mm,
Especially when you talk about the history. We can go back, 50 years before that when we talk about urban renewal, which I call it gentrification part one.
mhm, mhm.
With the building, of course, after World War II, with the building of the expressway, the interstates, and
Yep.
how that separated a lot of thriving Black metropolises, if you will, and especially if you talk about New Orleans, how you had, history, the great walks and the green spaces that
Mhm.
were blighted due to the building and construction of the freeway systems.
Right.
Especially if you talk about going through Treme and through the Seventh Ward,
Yeah.
um, but also in Sophia Town, there's a piece that I'm working on that just got accepted uh, by Rutler Taylor Francis, titled "Jazz, Vice, and Revolution." the rise and fall of the Sophiatown and Harlem Renaissances from 1920 to 1948. But looking at from New Orleans, because we know that's the jazz mecca. That's where the birth of jazz started.
Right.
Uh, so Sophiatown within its space was also a jazz mecca,
Mm.
where artistry and where politics also was a haven, if you will, for anti-colonialists, apartheid leaders of the like. So they talk about the shebens historically, or illegal vice bars
Mm.
where alcohol was served and where music was played. And the late Madiba definitely would have gone to a shebeen, to kick it, to drink,
Right.
to be merry. Again, this is how you deal with trauma. You also have to find spaces to escape that
Yeah.
trauma. Um, but always, when you have some sense of Black autonomy, white supremacy will always try to take it away.
Mm. That's so
And
true.
whether we're talking about policies, whether we're talking about laws, whether we're talking about apartheid system or Jim Crow, all of those are policies that were put in place to maintain Black subjugation, which I argue goes back to Achille Mbembe's necropolitics, right? Of
Mm.
how do certain communities get to live and get to die? And
Mm.
how do you, within this concept, there's another scholar by the name of Orlando Patterson, even though
Yeah.
he focused more on the African diaspora, but he talks about this concept of the social death and does how does Black trauma of being transitioned into something else. So prior to being an enslaved African, you were either Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba. How do you transform into a Black enslaved body? How does that work? What happens
Mm.
to the individual that's being commodified,
Mm.
and then to the family that's being left behind, because they're also going through a social death. I would
Yeah.
argue that social deaths also happen currently within places of trauma now that affects Black people. I believe that social death happened to Black victims of Katrina. I believe the social
Mm.
death happened to victims that were being ran out of town during Jim Crow, which many went up north
Yeah.
by the white mobs and by the KKK and other white hate groups. Then I would also argue with Sophiatown, with the settler colonialists of the Afrikaners, and not just the Afrikaners, but French, British, whatever, whoever, whatever of Europeans that were supporting the colonialist regime to their benefit,
Mm.
affected those communities. But there's something about Black joy and our it's I can only I'm a very spiritual person, so I feel that it comes to spirituality, of maintaining some sense of self that, okay, if you're going to push us out, we're going to form some community somewhere.
Right.
And that's what ended up happening with Sophiatown, with a lot of those families that were being displaced, separated, some going to Westbury, that I explained, others going to the Meadowlands. And then, of course, other areas such as not just in the Johannesburg region, but we can talk about Cape Town, we can talk about District 6, we can talk about what happened in Durban, even though that was pretty much still ran by the British during the apartheid regime.
Mm.
But it's uh, how do you make do with policy, and how does that affect Black communities to maintain some sense of um, of autonomy, if that makes sense,
Yeah. So
within spaces of being oppressed.
absolutely. I wanted to now pivot a little bit because you mentioned the transition from being Igbo or Wolof or
Mhm.
Uba into being first property and then given this name Black.
Mhm.
Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned homoplexy,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes,
Uh, And for all intents and purposes, that picture that you showed is a white man.
Yes.
Uh, right? So now I
Right.
want to discuss briefly identity. So
Mhm.
recently, there's been a big controversy around Tyler. In the United States, there was a problem with her identifying as colored. And we know that in these racialized societies, the social construct of race is kind of like on a spectrum, if you will, right?
Yeah.
In the US, race means one thing, or it's identified one way or defined one way. South Africa, Brazil, Australia, these different
Right.
places have all defined race differently.
Mhm.
However, as a Black studies professor, you're talking about the colored, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So in some way, you have lumped them into the to the Black experience, right? Because
Yeah.
there is some part of them that is African. So I
Right.
want you just maybe to address briefly, and this is the question that I asked um, Dr. Clarkson,
Mhm.
is being Black what you experience, or is it how the world experiences you? And I say that because if you look at the picture of Homer Plessy, does he experience the world that he is Black, but
Right.
does the world experience him as a Black?
Right. Oh, that's a great question, Dr. El Malik. Yes. I mean, I can do a presentation on that. So, okay. I'll start personally with myself. So I have a lot of family that look like Homer Plus, and they are very much Black people.
Yeah,
So of course we know that. So I'll start with I think the easiest way is to start with the American context first, and then I'll talk about the South African context of race, even though we have to understand that race is global. It's a global phenomenon, and white supremacy is
absolutely.
a global phenomenon. And there will be interconnections with it. So
Mhm.
first with the American context, um, so we have to understand that in terms of population, um, Black Americans are considered still a racial minority. Um, of course, there's debates. I live in New York now. I think that's debatable. I think it's larger than that.
Yeah.
Especially if you're talking about Dominicans, if you're talking about Puerto Ricans who might not see themselves as Black, and I'm like, hey, you should look Black to me. Um, so you have that. But then we'll get back to that as well. But and then of course with Louisiana and with New Orleans, that's kind of a unique historical context of race as well, to a certain extent.
Yeah, yeah,
Because you didn't have free people of color like in Alabama.
right.
So when you talk about, we have to talk about the larger context and the smaller context. But um, when we talk about how Blackness was formed, we have to understand that Blackness, like coloredness, were terms that were established by an outsider. We did not see ourselves as Black people. Oluda Equiano talks about that in his work. He saw himself as an Igbo from Isaka in Igbo land.
Mm.
When he came to the United States, or well, came to that region which we now know as the United States, in South Carolina, he had to be beaten into submission, kind of similar to watching, Roots with Kunta Kinte being
Yeah,
beaten, the
yeah,
making of a slave, the seasoning.
yeah,
That beating was accepting his Blackness, if that makes sense.
yeah.
So Blackness was something that we had to accept. It was not something that we chose. Because Blackness originally meant equal to unfree, equal to slave and property,
Yeah.
subhumanness, three-fifths of a human. We had to, as we always do for our resiliency and for our sake of mind, we had to accept our differences that, okay, we're not Igbo anymore, we're not Yoruba anymore, we're a collective, we're experiencing a collective Blackness.
Mm.
But we're going to re-articulate it as something else. We're not going to look at it as a racial thing. that was placed on us by an outsider, we're going to look at it as a cultural thing.
Mm.
So that's why it was important to have a Black Power movement. That's why it was important to have a Black is Beautiful movement. It's to say that we're proud of our Blackness, even though this was our Holocaust of something that was put on us, but it's something that I would not want to be anything but Black in the 21st century.
Yeah.
But we have to understand, because I always start with my class in my Black sociology class. I said white people create Black people, and folks are like, "What? Oh, Black people. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to understand that
Yeah.
that if you go back to 12th century Igbo land, and if you said, what are my Black, they wouldn't understand that. They would not understand that concept. I said, I'm Igbo, I'm
Right.
Yoruba, because your language, your food, your clothing, and customs were based on and represented your cultural group or your clan.
Yeah.
So, and Du Bois talks about that in the Souls of Black Folk. He talks about that, with the concept of this double consciousness, right?
Right.
You know,
Right.
you had the Egyptian, you had the Roman, you had the Indian, you had you had the German, but the Negro is the seventh son. Like what Black, what, like, yes, now over time I can say that we have Black music, we have our sense of Black language,
Yeah.
our lingo, but how does that equate to Blackness? Now, to get back to your question about coloredness, with Thailand,
Mm.
I think it's also important to understand that, again, um, the color category, just like, again, like the Black category, those were terms that were established by outsiders. So during apartheid, the color category was created and crafted and placed on those mixed race groups of people. And even it went even further. It was Cape colored and colored Indian, colored African, colored, you had all these subcategories
Yeah.
that were established due to support and maintaining the apartheid regime. And the history goes back to slavery, because oftentimes when we talk about South African history, we might talk about colonialism, we definitely talk about apartheid, but we don't talk about the Cape of Good Hope
Yeah.
during the 17th century, which was a huge hub because Cape Town, or the Cape of Good Hope, modern day Cape Town, abutted both the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the
Right.
Indian Ocean to the east. And you had Africans brought from a Portuguese slave ship from Angola that were brought to Cape Town. But then also you had um, Southeast Asians that were coming from
Yeah.
Sri Lanka as enslaved labor as well. And interestingly enough, many of those those enslaved Sri Lankans came from those ancient Africans and Egyptians that were enslaved and brought there during the Indian Ocean slave trade and the Arabic slave trade of the earlier centuries. So
Wow.
those Southeast Asians were also of African descent, I would argue.
Wow.
Um, they were
Interesting.
definitely they definitely weren't white.
Right.
So, and they blended with the Khoisan population, which is the indigenous population, which is very similar to, like, with New Orleans in the context when you think of enslaved Africans that were also intermarrying with the indigenous, population and I go beyond Louisiana. I'm talking about like the whole area, Alabama, Mississippi, the
Yeah.
Louisiana Purchase, right before 1803. That
Right.
region that mixed and created also an Afro-Indian,
African.
Afro-Indigenous population
Yeah.
of mixture.
Yeah.
So with that, when you come to Tyla, you know, I see her colored. I just see it as a cultural, because it's not just a race; it's a culture. Like, there's a colored culture or colored
Yeah.
cultures, right? In terms of lingo, language, and depending on the region of South Africa, because if you go to Durban, you'll have a colored South African. I can't speak Afrikaans. I speak English.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so it depends on the region. But I would definitely argue that. And I've talked to some coloreds who do identify as Black. They'll say, well, I see myself as a Black person. However, on paper, I'm racialized as colored. And that goes back to, well, what's your last name? Many colored
Yeah.
people have names of the oppressor, like African Americans do, right?
Yep. Right.
So, or it might be the month of where their ancestors were brought to the Cape of Good Hope. So you have a lot of folks that have last name of December, January, March, February. Um,
Wow.
Sometimes the season, autumn, winter. It's really fascinating, to find out, at least they have some semblance of idea of where their ancestors came from, if they weren't
Yeah.
already there. So I hope that answered.
Yeah. No. Very,
But I could
very
go
much so.
on, like, because but at the end of the day, Tyler's a Black woman, okay? And if she's in Chicago walking down the street, she's a Black woman, okay?
Yeah, and the
So
American, we got to be clear because we don't want to offend our South
right, in
African
the American
friends
context.
in American
But I
context.
but I also accept when I go to South Africa, I put on my colored hat. Like I know that I'm gonna be seen and
Yeah,
I'm gonna be portrayed as a colored person because that I'm entering into South Africa.
that
Now, but
context.
I'll be quick with you real quick. The first time I was like, no, I'm not. Like,
Yeah,
but I've accepted,
yeah,
and of course, people that I am friends with, they understand context, they understand, you know,
yeah, yeah.
but of course, there's going to be a lot of folks out there that won't understand context, which is
Yeah. So I want because we have about 5 minutes left, and
oh
I want
yes,
to get into this confinement of Black bodies. And as you
yes.
were talking, I wrote plantations, prisons, and projects.
Mm,
Now, as we talk about the confinement of Black bodies, you mentioned
that's a good
how
title.
you can use it. Just
That's
like
your look. Let's work on our article together.
yes. All right. All
We
right.
did
All
talk
right. Let's
about
do it.
that, so okay. Let's explore this. Okay, yeah. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. So as we talk about how urban renewal and
Yeah.
infrastructure divided communities, placed, destroyed Black Tremaine, right? Um, maybe just in a very very brief way,
Mhm.
how is it that we kind of continue to be placed in these silos
Mhm.
where our systems and our cultures are easily manipulated and easily destroyed? What ways can we fend that type of we know it's kind of hard to fend off against prison, but in terms of urban renewal and places where we live, how can we fend off against these things?
I mean, no, that's a great question. So I think a lot of it now this is when we start getting into politics and getting into, you know, um, do we know who our local aldermen are? Do we know who our local constituencies are? Who are our leaders, or who are
Yeah,
our so-called leaders? Because you brought up the concept of silos, I feel that when we talk about the Black movements, right, even now, there's so much segregation of certain groups.
true.
It kind of goes back to how we're always separated, whether it's through gender, sexuality, whatever. Like, there's got to be some where we respect people's differences to
Uh-huh.
focus on the main issue that we're all being, as Black people, regardless of whatever, we're all
Right,
being affected.
right,
So put that aside so that we can come together and be solid. We have to be solid, number one. And we're fractured, unfortunately,
unfortunately.
as a community. Because I don't say that we're a Black community, I say we're Black communities, plural. And
Right,
what we need to do is there needs to be some way, and that's not to say that there shouldn't be different organizations. Obviously, you got to have different organizations. We got to look at the micro and the macro, right? We can't,
right,
of course, I say Kemet wasn't built in one day.
right.
So, we have to understand that, we have to, I think that's why it's good for the platform that you have, right? with Access, the platform that I have with Black Studies, to educate the history. Because if we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're going. So I think it's a both and in terms of we have to link with both the Academy of Black Studies, but also, or where we're talking about Wits University, or where we're talking about the State University of New York. But also, we have to go back into the community as well and work with key leaders there and understand that there's education in the streets as well, right?
Yeah,
Because that's
absolutely.
where I believe Black Studies started, was in the streets.
Right.
So I think, I don't know if that's a good answer, but I feel that there has to be knowledge of your community. There's knowledge of how did your community get to the space in the first place? How did we get to this Jim Crow? How did we get to even with gang activity, right? Where that's also Black confinement, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're calling the crossfire, you're definitely within the confinement.
Right. Exactly.
So there's a lot of issues, that are plaguing our community, but I feel that we need to have right leaders that are to be those soundboards and to be those links with different groups so that we can come together, because we have to have some type of Black solidarity. And not to say that we're a Black solidarity movement, but there's true solidarity and genuine solidarity, and we're respecting people's differences to move forward.
Dr. Proctor, thank you so much. Every time I say your name, I think of what is that show? Is it Power?
Oh God.
Proctor was the Jewish
Right.
yeah, he was something else. But thank you so
Right.
much for
Thank you.
for
Thank
your
you.
lecture, man. We really appreciate it. I'm sorry we didn't get to the comments on YouTube, but the replay is there, and they are loving this topic. So we will be back next week. Actually, 2 days in a row. On the Tuesday, the 27th, I will be giving a lecture on the development of African American Islam, African American Islam, and then on Wednesday, the sister from the National Council of Black Studies, Dr. Alicia Fonette. Sister's from New Orleans, and she got one of them French names. And it's hard every time, but the sister, she went to Dillard, but she will be discussing Black women and popular culture. So that'll definitely be something powerful. So to all those who are watching on YouTube, we definitely appreciate you guys watching. And so tune in next week. And I'm going to end the live stream. Let's see, how do we end the live stream?